Good afternoon, Earthlings. So, I don't want to be the harbinger of bad tidings. Recent reports are reflecting that the United States Central Intelligence Agency is sending drones over Mexico to locate fentanyl labs. Additionally, the United States military are using U-2s and other surveillance planes to gather intel for the military that's trying to put together a program and providing it to Mexico, who seems not so ready to use that information to interdict these drug shipments and going after the labs that are found by the United States. Since the United States has categorized these cartels as terrorist organizations, not only does it provide an opportunity for economic sanctions, seizure of assets, but also if we pay attention to other world events, Yemen, Pakistan, many other countries where we've dropped hellfire and other ordnance on terrorists, is there a possibility that the same thing is going to happen here? If you read the post at crazyoldgringo.mx, that's crazyoldgringo.mx, you'll see that the United States has invaded Mexico many times, and President Scheinbaum has addressed that very issue. I guess this all comes down to statistics. Will it happen again? And is it likely that Trump and his acolytes are going to do the same thing to try to enforce their will? Is it good? Is it bad? And what's going to happen to the expat Americans and Canadians that are living in Mexico during this time? With that said, enjoy the podcast.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep into this conflict that's brewing between the U.S. and Mexico over fentanyl. And things are getting, pretty tense.
Absolutely.
We've got a couple of sources to dig into today.
Okay.
We've got this blog post from Crazy Old Gringo, who is this American expat living down in Mexico. And then we also have this briefing document that outlines, the latest in U.S.-Mexico relations and the cartel war as of February 2025.
Interesting.
So by the end of this, you'll know who the players are, what they want, and what could happen if this all keeps escalating.
It's a really complex situation.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to start with, how severe the fentanyl crisis is in the U.S. Because it's really fueling this whole conflict.
For sure. And what's really caught my eye is how the U.S. is responding.
Yeah.
It's like straight out of spy movie. We're talking like covert CIA drone flights.
Oh, wow.
Well into sovereign Mexico.
Yeah.
To try and pinpoint these fentanyl labs.
Yeah.
Plus, you've got all this increased military surveillance along the border with all this fancy aircraft like U-2s and RC-135 rivet joints. They've even got like a dedicated task force of 140 analysts sifting through all this intel.
That's right. They're really prioritizing a technological approach.
Right.
They are sharing some of this intel with Mexican officials.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of pressure for Mexico to send more troops.
Okay.
And it really does make you wonder, is this going to be effective or could it backfire?
Yeah, especially considering the history between the U.S. and Mexico. Mexico's made it very clear they're not going to tolerate anything that even smells like an invasion.
Yeah, President Scheinbaum has been very vocal about that.
Right.
She's open to collaborating, but not if it feels like the U.S. is dictating, all the terms. And, this tension isn't new.
Yeah.
U.S.-Mexico relations have always been a bit fraught.
Right.
The U.S. has intervened in Mexican affairs multiple times.
Right.
And that's created this deep sensitivity to any, perceived threats to their autonomy.
So with all that baggage, it's no wonder that Mexico is pushing back so hard
Oh, yeah.
against this, this push to designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
Yeah, that's a major point of escalation here.
Yeah.
I think to really understand the implications, we need to understand what that FTO designation actually means.
Right.
So it essentially gives the U.S. government a whole new set of tools to deal with these cartels.
Okay.
It could pave the way for things like sanctions, freezing assets, and even more military involvement.
So it's not just about, like, labels. It's about potentially opening the door to more aggressive actions. Maybe even military intervention.
Precisely. And you've got the Defense Secretary Hegseth saying all options are on the table.
Wow.
And then you've got people like Elon Musk saying that cartels can now be targeted with drone strikes.
Right.
I mean, it's hard not to be concerned.
And especially when you consider that these fentanyl labs are often, like, hidden within urban areas.
Yeah.
Airstrikes could lead to just devastating civilian casualties.
There's a major concern.
Has the U.S. considered those, ramifications?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people are asking.
Right.
While a full-scale military invasion might be unlikely, there are other ways that the U.S. could assert itself.
Okay.
We're already seeing an increase in U.S. training of Mexican forces.
Yeah.
So, less dramatic, but still significant.
Right. It's still a form of intervention.
Yeah.
So even without troops on the ground, the U.S. is still trying to shape, the situation down in Mexico.
Yeah.
But what about Mexico's response to all of this?
Well, Mexico is not just accepting these developments passively. In addition to President Sheinbaum's strong stance against any kind of U.S. intervention, they're taking concrete steps to address the situation on their own terms.
Okay.
They're pushing for these constitutional reforms to safeguard their sovereignty.
Right.
They're cracking down on arms trafficking.
Okay.
And they're even exploring legal action.
Legal action? What do you mean?
So Mexico has taken this bold step of filing lawsuits against U.S. gun manufacturers.
Yeah.
Their argument is that this flood of weapons from the U.S. into Mexico is directly fueling the violence of the cartels.
Yeah.
It's a way for them to, shift the blame or at least share it.
Right.
And it directly challenges this U.S. narrative that Mexico isn't doing enough to combat the problem.
It's like they're saying, you want to talk about responsibility.
Exactly.
Let's talk about where these weapons are coming from.
Right. It's a strategic move
that
adds a whole new layer of complexity to this already tense situation.
And to add to that complexity, we've also seen some interesting personnel changes.
Yeah.
The U.S. has appointed Ronald Johnson, a former CIA paramilitary officer, as their ambassador to Mexico.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's a very deliberate choice.
Right.
And it's not the only one.
Okay.
Joe Kent, another former CIA officer, is now heading up the National Counterterrorism Center.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the U.S. is, putting together this team that signals a move toward a more militarized approach to this, drug war.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about their long-term strategy here.
Right.
But, in the midst of all this talk about drones and troops, it's important to remember that Mexico's not just sitting back and taking orders.
Right. They're taking action on their own terms.
Yeah.
It sounds like they're pushing back on multiple fronts. You've got President Sheinbaum's strong stance against any kind of U.S. intervention. You've got these constitutional reforms, and then the crackdown on arms trafficking. And then, of course, there's that lawsuit against U.S. gun manufacturers.
Yeah, that lawsuit's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it challenges the U.S. narrative in a very direct way.
Yeah.
They're basically saying this flow of weapons from the U.S. is fueling the violence here. You can't just blame us for everything.
Yeah.
It forces the U.S. to confront its own role in this really complex issue.
It's like they're calling for a more balanced approach.
Exactly.
Like acknowledging that both sides have a part to play in finding a solution.
Yeah. And that brings us to a crucial point here.
Okay.
What does all of this mean?
Right.
What's the potential outcome of this escalating conflict?
Well, from what we've talked about so far, it seems like we've got a very volatile situation brewing here. The U.S. is ramping up the pressure. Mexico is pushing back.
Right.
And the potential for things to spiral out of control feels very real.
It does.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the human cost here.
Yeah.
The Mexican people are caught in the middle of this.
Right.
So many of them are just trying to survive in the midst of all this chaos.
That's a really good point. I think it's easy to get caught up in all the political maneuvering and, the military strategy. But ultimately, this is about real people's lives.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this situation so complex and so concerning.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers here.
Yeah.
And any path forward is fraught with danger.
Right.
I mean, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
If the U.S. pushes too hard, they risk alienating Mexico and further destabilizing the region.
Right.
But if they don't act decisively, then the fentanyl crisis is just going to keep claiming lives.
Yeah.
It's a really tough call, and one with potentially devastating consequences.
It feels like we're standing at a crossroads here. We've seen how the U.S. is approaching this. We've seen how Mexico is responding.
Correct.
But where do we go from here? Yeah, it feels like we're on the edge of something big.
Right.
But it's hard to know what will happen next.
Absolutely.
This whole situation makes you really think about the potential long-term consequences of all this.
Right.
Will increased U.S. involvement actually solve the fentanyl crisis?
Right.
Or is it just going to make things worse?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
If history has taught us anything, is that military interventions rarely achieve their intended goals, especially when it comes to complex issues like drug trafficking. There's a real risk that increased U.S. involvement could backfire. It could further empower the cartels and exacerbate the violence.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Right.
You think you're doing something, but you just end up making things worse.
Right. And we also have to consider the potential impact on the Mexican people.
Yeah.
Increased militarization could lead to human rights abuses, displacement, and further erosion of trust in the government.
It just seems like a dangerous path to go down.
It is.
What strikes me is how this situation highlights the interconnectedness of everything.
Absolutely.
We're talking about drug trafficking, but it's also about geopolitics, economics, and the deep-seated issues within both the U.S. and Mexico.
It's not just about pointing fingers and placing blame.
It's a reminder that there are no simple solutions. We need to move beyond this blame game and start addressing the root causes of this crisis.
Right. That means tackling things like poverty, lack of opportunity, and even looking at, the demand for drugs in the U.S.
It's a complex challenge for sure.
It is.
But it's one that we just can't afford to ignore.
Absolutely.
If we really want to make a difference. We got to start having some honest conversations about the role that the U.S. plays in this crisis and explore some alternative approaches that prioritize collaboration and harm reduction.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
This is a defining moment in U.S.-Mexico relations, and the choices that we make now will have a ripple effect
for sure
for years to come.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
It's clear that the situation is complex.
Yeah.
It's volatile. And there are just no easy answers.
No easy answers.
But it's so important that we stay informed,
Absolutely.
Engage in these thoughtful discussions and hold our leaders accountable for finding solutions that actually work, towards peace, justice, and the well-being of all people.
We've only scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
But hopefully you now have a better understanding of, the forces at play and the potential consequences of this escalating conflict.
For sure.
There's always more to learn,
Yeah.
more perspectives to consider, and more to discuss.
Absolutely. Keep those brains buzzing, everyone.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy diving.